The meeting lasted 11 minutes. Diane Osei had worked for Caldwell Precision Technologies for 17 years, had been the company's director of operations for 9 of those years, had overseen a period of growth that had taken the company from 60 employees to 240, had been present for every quality certification process and every major vendor relationship and every production challenge that had defined the company's operational identity across those 9 years. And the meeting that ended her employment there lasted 11 minutes. She had timed it afterward, reconstructing the conversation in detail in the parking lot while sitting in her car with her hands on the wheel and the banker's box on the seat beside her, because it seemed important to know exactly how long it had taken to undo 17 years, and the answer was 11 minutes, which she thought about for a long time and then put down and did not pick up again. The CEO who fired her was named Carter Aldrich. He had been at Caldwell for 4 years, brought in from outside through a search process that the board had conducted with the specific energy of people who had decided on an answer before they began the search and were moving through the process primarily to confirm that answer. And his mandate had been to lead a restructuring that the board had decided was necessary. Though necessary was a word that could be made to cover almost anything if you used it with enough confidence and enough PowerPoint slides showing directional arrows. Carter was 44 years old and had the specific quality of a man who had learned to perform decisiveness so thoroughly that the performance had become indistinguishable from the thing itself, at least to people who were not paying close attention to the gap between the decisions being made and the outcomes they were producing. He was good with boards and good with investors, and not particularly good with the people who actually ran the operations he was charged with overseeing, which was not a problem as long as those operations continued to run themselves, which they did largely because of Diane Osei. The stated reason for the termination was restructuring, the same word that had been used to cover most of what Carter Aldrich had done at Caldwell since his arrival. A word that served the specific function of making change sound inevitable and therefore unquestionable, as if the organization were a river that had simply found a new course, rather than a collection of decisions that someone had made and that someone else might have made differently. Her position was being eliminated. The role was being absorbed into a new organizational structure that Carter had been developing with an outside consulting firm for the previous 6 months. A firm that had billed the company $340,000 for a report that Diane had read twice, carefully, and found to contain a significant number of recommendations that she had made internally over the previous 2 years. In meetings and memos and in a formal strategy document she had submitted 14 months ago, and that had been received at the time with polite acknowledgement and no action. She had not cried during the meeting, which she considered a minor personal achievement. She had not argued because she had understood, within the first 2 minutes, that arguing was not the function the meeting was designed to serve, and that Carter had already made his decision before she walked in, probably several days before, possibly with a specific Friday afternoon time slot chosen, because experience had suggested that Friday afternoons produced the least resistance and the quickest exits. She had asked 2 practical questions about the severance package, received 2 practical answers, signed the acknowledgement form that had been prepared in advance, and walked out with a banker's box of her personal items that someone had packed for her while the meeting was happening, which was the detail that told her the most about how thoroughly she had been managed. She sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, the banker's box on the seat beside her, and she did not cry, which she considered a minor personal achievement, and she did not call Patrick, because the conversation with Patrick required more than a parking lot offered in terms of what she would need to say and what she would need to hear. She thought about 17 years. She thought about the specific texture of building something slowly across that span, of knowing a company's operations well enough to understand not just what was going wrong, but what was about to go wrong. The specific institutional knowledge that takes years to accumulate and that cannot be transferred through a consulting report or a restructuring diagram. The kind of knowledge that lives in a person and moves with them when they leave. She thought about Carter Aldrich and his 4 years and his consulting firm and the $340,000 report. She thought about Monday. On Monday, she would have to figure out what came next. She had savings, a mortgage that was manageable, a husband named Patrick, who had been expecting this call for 6 months and who had said 3 times in the previous year, twice at dinner and once on a Sunday morning when she had come home from the office looking like someone who had lost an argument she had not expected to need to have, that he thought she should leave before they pushed her out and take her knowledge somewhere it would be properly used. Each time she had told him she was not the kind of person who left before things were finished, which was true about her in a way that had not always served her well, particularly in situations where the thing she was finishing was not actually the same thing that the person above her thought was being finished, but that she had stopped trying to change because changing it would require changing something more fundamental than a habit. She drove home. She told Patrick. He said the things that Patrick said when he had been right about something and was not the kind of man to make that the focus, which was why she had married him. She made dinner. She went to bed. She lay in the dark for a while and thought about what she actually knew, which was considerable, and about what she wanted to do with it, which she did not yet know. What she knew was this. Caldwell Precision Technologies made specialized components for aerospace and defense contractors, components that required exact tolerances and specific certifications that had taken years to establish and that represented, in the competitive landscape of their industry, a genuine barrier to entry that most potential competitors could not easily replicate. She knew the operations with the specific intimacy of someone who had built them, who had been present for every quality certification process and every vendor relationship and every production challenge that had surfaced in 9 years of running the company's day-to-day. She knew the employees, most of them by name, all of them by function, and she knew which ones were excellent and which ones were coasting and which ones were being underused in positions that did not require what they actually had to offer. What she also knew, because she had been paying attention during 6 months of Carter Aldrich's restructuring discussions that she had been included in until, she now understood, she had stopped being useful to include, was that Caldwell had a problem with a specific government contract that was up for renewal in 8 months. A contract that represented 31% of the company's revenue and that the contracting agency had signaled, in language that the people reading the signals correctly would have understood, was not going to be renewed automatically under the current operational configuration. She had understood this signal. She had prepared a response strategy. She had presented the response strategy to Carter in a meeting 4 months ago. Carter had received it politely and done nothing with it. She spent the weekend thinking, and by Sunday evening she had the shape of something she wanted to do, though she was not yet certain it was the right shape. She called her friend and former colleague, Janet Wu, who had left Caldwell 2 years earlier to take a role at a private equity firm that focused on industrial manufacturing, and asked Janet if she had an hour to talk. Janet said she had 2 hours and a good bottle of wine and came over on Sunday evening. Diane laid out what she knew, the specifics of Caldwell's operational position, the certification advantages, the government contract situation, the structural problems that Carter's restructuring was creating without solving, the specific window of vulnerability that the next 6 months represented. Janet listened to all of it and then refilled both glasses and asked how much runway Diane thought the company had before the contract situation became critical. Diane said 8 months to renewal, probably 3 months before the contracting agency made a preliminary decision, which meant approximately 3 months in which the problem could still be addressed by someone who understood what the problem actually was. Janet said she knew people at 2 firms that had been looking at the industrial precision manufacturing space and that she thought this was a conversation worth having. She set down her glass and was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was thinking rather than when she had nothing to say, which was a distinction Diane had learned across 20 years of knowing her. She said she wanted to be clear that conversations like this went many different directions and that she was not making any promises about outcomes, and that the timing was going to matter enormously because this kind of opportunity had a specific window, and the window was defined by the contract renewal timeline that Diane had just described, but that the specific combination of operational knowledge and market timing that Diane was describing was the kind of thing that certain investors were actively looking for. Diane said she understood. She said she was not looking for promises. She was looking for a conversation, and she was ready to have it immediately. The conversation happened on Tuesday, in a glass-walled conference room in Janet's firm's office with two partners who had the specific quality of people who ask fewer questions than they appear to be asking, listening in a way that was collecting information rather than simply receiving it. Then again on Thursday, with a different group who had been briefed by Janet and who arrived already interested and asking more specific questions about the certification process and the competitive landscape. Then with different people the following Monday, a larger group with more questions about the financial structure and the acquisition timeline. Diane talked to 4 different groups in 12 days, and she talked to them with the specific confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about, which is the most persuasive quality available to any person making any case, because it is the one quality that cannot be performed convincingly enough to substitute for the actual thing. What she proposed was not complicated. She wanted to acquire Caldwell Precision Technologies. She wanted to do it quickly, before the government contract situation became public knowledge in a way that would either drive up the asking price through competition or drive it down through panic. She wanted to do it with backing from investors who understood industrial manufacturing and who were willing to let her run the operation the way she understood it needed to be run, which was differently from how it was currently being run. The investors she was talking to understood what she was describing. One of the groups, a mid-market private equity firm named Frontier Industrial Partners, had been tracking Caldwell for 2 years and had been waiting for exactly the kind of moment that Diane's knowledge and the contract situation were together creating. They moved quickly, which was what the situation required. Diane spent 4 weeks in intensive due diligence conversations, providing the operational detail that only someone with her specific history could provide, filling in the spaces between the numbers that public filings and third-party reports could not reach, the specific knowledge of which processes were fragile, and which were robust, and which vendor relationships would survive a change in ownership, and which would require careful management. Through the transition, she was not just advising the transaction. She was, in a very direct sense, the transaction, in that what Frontier was buying was not just a company's assets and certifications, but access to the specific institutional knowledge that the company's departing director of operations carried, knowledge that would transfer with her if she was involved, and that would evaporate from the company if she was not, leaving behind the shell of an operation without the understanding of how to run it 6 weeks after she had walked out of Caldwell's parking lot with a banker's box that someone else had packed for her during an 11-minute meeting. The acquisition offer was submitted. It was structured in a way that Carter Aldrich and the current board found difficult to decline, not because the price was overwhelming, but because the specific timing was precise in a way that timing in these situations often is not. Arriving in the window before the government contract situation had become something they would need to disclose to potential acquirers or to the contracting agency itself. A window that was closing, and that made accepting a reasonable offer now more attractive than the alternative of navigating the next 3 months without it. Carter had apparently figured out somewhere in the previous few weeks that the contract situation was more serious than he had previously understood. He had been looking at options. Diane's offer, arriving through Frontier, was in its own way an answer to his problem, even as it removed the problem from his hands. The board voted on a Thursday. The acquisition closed 3 weeks later, after a process that moved at the pace of people who understood that time was the most expensive variable in the negotiation. The new organizational structure of what would be renamed Caldwell. Industrial Precision was announced on a Monday morning, 6 weeks after the close of the acquisition, in a company-wide communication that Diane had written herself, which she had decided was important, that the first communication from the new leadership should come in her voice rather than through a communications department, should be direct about what had changed and honest about what the company was going to focus on going forward. Diane Osei was named Chief Executive Officer. She arrived at the Caldwell building at 7:45 that Monday morning, earlier than she had needed to arrive as director of operations because she had wanted to be there before most people, to walk through the building in the specific quiet of a place not yet fully populated with the day's energy and to feel it before it felt her. Not through the executive entrance where she had arrived for 9 years as director of operations, but through the main entrance, which she had decided was where she intended. To arrive from now on because she had spent 9 years arriving through a different door than the people she was responsible for and had not found it served the understanding she wanted to have of what the building actually contained. She walked to the front desk, where a receptionist named Maricela, who had been at the company for 11 years, looked up from her computer, and her face did something complicated and genuine at once. The specific expression of someone receiving a return they had not been certain was coming, and that they were glad about in a way that had nothing to do with hierarchy. And Diane said, "Good morning, Maricela," and Maricela said, "Welcome back," and meant it in a way that had nothing to do with what was written on Diane's business card. Carter Aldrich had departed the previous Friday, as part of a leadership transition that the acquisition documents had been specific about. Specific in the way that acquisition documents are specific, when the people writing them understand that ambiguity in this particular section would be costly for everyone. He had received what his contract entitled him to receive, which was more than he had earned in Diane's private assessment, but which was the cost of the transaction, and therefore not the thing to object to, and had left with the specific quality of a man who understood that the situation had turned in a direction he had not anticipated, and that the most dignified available response was to leave, without making the direction change more visible than it already was. He had packed his own box without the 11-minute meeting, without the advance preparation of someone else doing it for him. And Diane thought about this briefly on Monday morning and then stopped thinking about it because it was not the thing she needed to be thinking about. What she needed to be thinking about was the company, which was the same thing she had been thinking about for 17 years and which felt, now, different in a way she had not quite anticipated. Not larger, not more important, but more fully hers in the sense that the alignment between what she understood needed to happen and her authority to make it happen was now complete in a way it had never been when she was director of operations, and the decisions she could make were bounded by someone above her who had less information and made decisions with it. Anyway, she spent the first week in conversations she had been wanting to have for 2 years, conversations that had been blocked, not by the people she was talking to, but by the layer of approval above her that had treated operational improvements as proposals requiring review rather than as decisions requiring execution. She talked to the production team about the quality certification process and where it was adding friction it did not need to add, friction that had accumulated over 3 years of small decisions that had made individual sense and collective nonsense. She talked to the engineering team about 2 projects that had been stalled in the approval process for reasons she had never found convincing and that the engineers had. She could see in the quality of their attention during the conversation. Been waiting for someone with authority to say out loud were not convincing reasons. She talked to the finance team about the vendor contract review she had recommended 18 months ago and that had never been initiated. She talked to Maricela about the front desk process and what could be made simpler, and Maricela told her 3 things that could be simpler, and that Maricela had been trying to get changed for a year and a half. She did not talk to anyone about Carter Aldrich or about the circumstances of her departure and return. This was a deliberate decision, made not out of graciousness toward someone who had not earned it, but out of a clear-eyed understanding that the story of what had happened was not the story that needed to be told going forward, and that organizations that spend significant energy on the story of how they got to where they are spend less energy on the work of getting to where they need to be. The people who had been there knew what had happened. The people who were new would learn what mattered about the past from the quality of the present they were now inside. The story that needed to be told was the one she was writing now, which was about the company and the people in it and the work that needed to be done to secure the government contract, renewal and stabilize the business and build the thing that it could become if it was run the way she knew it could be run. The government contract was renewed 7 months later, at a value that represented a 12% increase over the previous contract, the result of a renewal process that Diane had managed with the specific attention of someone for whom this had not been an abstract strategic priority, but a concrete and personal one. The thing she had spent 8 months knowing was coming and preparing for across every dimension she could influence. The contracting agency's representative described the outcome. In a brief conversation with Diane after the signing over coffee in a government building conference room that smelled like recycled air and institutional carpet, as reflecting the confidence the agency had developed in Caldwell's operational reliability over the previous 2 years and its enhanced confidence in the leadership direction under the new ownership. Diane thanked him. She did not say that the operational reliability he was describing had been built over 9 years, and had survived a restructuring attempt that had nearly dismantled it. She had learned, across 17 years of working in organizations, that the people who understood what had happened always knew, and that the people who did not understand were not going to be educated by her telling them. She called Patrick that evening from the parking lot, which was the same parking lot she had sat in on the Friday she was fired, with the banker's box on the seat beside her. Though she had not consciously thought about that as she was pulling in that morning, and she thought about it now, sitting in the same parking lot with the same city sounds around her and an entirely different set of facts about what she was driving home from. She told him the contract was renewed. He asked how she felt. She thought about it for a moment, actually thought about it rather than producing the automatic answer, and said she felt like herself, which was not a common feeling for her or for most people she had known well enough to know how they actually felt about their own lives, and which she recognized, having learned to recognize it across many years and many situations in which she had not felt it, as something worth protecting and worth being precise about when it arrived. She drove home. She made dinner, something she had not done with full attention for several months, and that felt, tonight, like something she wanted to do carefully rather than efficiently, a distinction that only mattered when you had enough margin to notice it. Patrick opened a bottle of wine that he had been saving for something worth opening it for, without making a specific thing of the gesture, simply opening it as the obvious choice for the evening, and they sat at the kitchen table and talked about the company and the contract and the things she was planning for the next 2 years. And it was a good evening, the kind that does not announce itself as a good evening in the moment it is happening, but that you recognize by its texture, the particular quality of a conversation between two people who have been through something together and are now on the other side of it, the feeling of being fully in your own life and finding it, in the specific shape it has taken through specific and sometimes difficult choices, to be what you actually wanted. Before you go, I want to leave you with something that I think is the actual center of this story, which is not the acquisition or the return or the title change or even the contract renewal. It is the Saturday morning after Diane was fired, when she sat at her kitchen table and thought about what she actually knew. She did not sit there feeling sorry for herself, though she could have. She did not waste the specific knowledge she had accumulated across 17 years in bitterness about how it had been undervalued. She looked at what she had and asked what she could build with it, and the answer turned out to be the very company that had just let her go. Carter Aldrich made a mistake that many people with power make, which is to confuse the organization with the person who is running it, to believe that the knowledge and competence that make a company work belong to the structure rather than to the specific human beings who built the structure and are keeping it alive. He removed the person. He thought he had restructured the company. He had, in fact, handed her everything she needed to buy it. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who then had to watch you prove them wrong? Tell me what that felt like. And if this story gave you something to carry, share it today with someone who needs to be reminded that being dismissed is not the same thing as being defeated. Subscribe and turn on the bell. The next story is coming. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I will see you in the next one.